The Earl of Carrenmore did not raise his voice. He never did. He had a manner of speaking that made each word land, like a stone dropped in still water, and the silence after it was always the worst part. Elowen had been at Carrenmore House for 4 months when he sent for her. The summons came through Prosper Hind, the estate steward, a compact, careful man of 53 with ink-stained fingers and a habit of appearing in doorways before you knew he was there. He found her in the East Gallery at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, rehanging a set of curtains that had been left crooked since before she arrived. She had learned in her first week that if she wanted a thing done in this house, she would need to do it herself. The staff were not unkind, merely uncertain, moving around her the way people move around news that has not yet been confirmed. Hinde looked at the curtains. Then he looked at her hands on the fabric, which were not the hands of a countess, and he did not say anything about that. "His lordship requires you," he said, "the study at once." Elowen stepped down from the stool. "May I finish this first?" Hinde waited with the patience of a man who had already decided her answer would not matter. She followed him. The study was at the front of the house, with tall windows that looked out over the gravel drive and the stone wall beyond it. Elowen had been in it twice since the wedding. Once to sign a document she had not been given enough time to read, and once to inform the Earl that there was a crack in the west wing ceiling that was getting larger. He had thanked her in the tone of a man thanking a stranger for directions, and the ceiling was still cracked. She was not expecting an audience. There were 7 people in the study when she walked in, Mrs. Larkin the housekeeper, and 6 others. Footman, the cook, and the 2 youngest girls from the kitchen who could not have been past 15. They stood in a line against the bookcase, hands folded, not quite meeting her eyes. Elowen understood then what this was. Stellan Galt, Earl of Carrenmore, stood at the center of the room with a document in his hand. He was 31 years old and looked older, not from age but from a certain settled coldness, the kind that comes from deciding very early what a person is and never revisiting the question. He was not an unattractive man. She had thought once, in the church 4 months ago, watching him turn to look at her with that level, assessing gaze, she had thought, perhaps something could be made of this. Perhaps 2 people could build a life from a transaction, if both of them were honest about what it was. He had ended that thought at the wedding supper when he had set down his wine glass and said, without particular cruelty, "I should be plain with you. This marriage was contracted for money. If the money does not come, I will not pretend otherwise." Then he had gone to Edinburgh for 6 weeks, and by the time he returned, Elowen had stopped expecting anything. Now he held up the document. "Do you know what this is?" Elowen looked at it from across the room. A letter. Official paper, heavy stock, folded once. "No, your lordship. It is from my solicitor in Edinburgh." He let it fall to his side. "It is the 3rd inquiry this year into the state of the marriage settlement. £12,000 was promised to this estate when I married you. Not 1 shilling of it has arrived." "I have written to my uncle 4 times, Elowen said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steady. "I am aware of that." The Earl looked at her the way a man looks at an arithmetic problem that keeps producing the wrong answer. "Your uncle does not respond." "He has never responded to anything. My mother wrote to him for years, and he never. There is no free bread in this house." The Earl said it quietly, which made it worse than shouting. "Not for me. Not for the people in this room who work 14 hours a day. Not for you." He crossed the room towards her. He held out the document. "Take this. Go to Edinburgh and find whatever family remains to you, and tell them to honor what they signed." He placed the document in her hand. The paper was thick and cold. "Go," said the Earl. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody breathed. The scullery girls were looking at the carpet. Elowen did not look at them. She looked at the Earl. Then she said, "Very well," because there was nothing else to say, and because she was not going to stand in a room with 7 witnesses and beg a man who had already decided what she was worth. She walked out. She got as far as the first landing before her legs slowed, and she sat down on the step because there was no one in the corridor to see it, and because sitting was the only alternative to falling. She pressed the document flat against her knee and breathed. Then she opened it. The letter was from a firm called Keswick & Sons, Edinburgh, solicitors of 30 years' standing. It detailed the outstanding balance of the Carrenmore marriage settlement and requested, in the formal language of men who have been patient longer than they wished to be, any documentation confirming payment had been issued by the guarantor. Guarantor, Elowen read the word twice. At the bottom of the page was a small printed mark, the seal of the financial institution that had backed the original transaction. A simple engraving, a 3-masted ship, sails full, and beneath it 3 letters interlocked, CTS. Elowen stopped breathing. She knew that mark. She had seen it once when she was 12 years old. Her mother had been ill, and Elowen had been going through the box on the highest shelf, looking for the spare key to the coal cupboard. Nothing else. And she had found a tin at the back, and on the tin was that seal. The ship with 3 masts. CTS. She had asked her mother what it meant, later, when her mother was well enough to sit up. Her mother had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "That was your grandfather's mark, Cyrus Trescott. He owned a trading company. Once." A pause. "He does not know you exist, and I would prefer he never did." Elowen sat on the step of Carrenmore House for a long time. The document lay across her knees. Cyrus Trescott & Sons. The man who had just told her to go and find her family had sent her out the door holding her grandfather's seal. She did not tell anyone. That was her first decision, and she made it there on the stair. And the reason had nothing to do with cleverness. The reason was that if she walked back into the study and said, "The institution backing this settlement is my grandfather's trading company," the Earl would look at her with that calm, cold accountant's expression and say, "Then, write to him. Ask him for the $12,000 he owes me." And she would have to stand in front of 7 people and explain that she could not. That her grandfather had cut off her mother 20 years ago for marrying a man he considered beneath them. That her mother had written to him every year for as long as Elowen could remember, and he had never once written back. That Cyrus Trescott, if he was still alive, did not know she existed, and she had no reason to believe he would want to. She would have to say aloud, in that study in front of those girls, "I have a grandfather worth more than this entire estate, and he threw us away, and I cannot ask him for a single thing." She would rather walk to Edinburgh. She wrapped the document in her handkerchief and put it at the bottom of her sewing basket. Then she went down to the kitchen to ask for hot water because it was 9 in the morning and there was work, and the only way she knew to move through a humiliation was to move. Mrs. Larkin found her in the linen room an hour later, refolding sheets. The housekeeper stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. She was 62, with the broad, careful face of a woman who had kept her opinions to herself for 40 years and had begun to wonder whether the effort had been worth it. "Your ladyship," she said at last, "that is Betsy's work." "Betsy has 12 other rooms," said Elowen, without looking up, "and these have not been folded properly since October." Mrs. Larkin came into the room and shut the door behind her. She stood by the shelf, with her hands at her sides. "He should not have done that," she said quietly. "Not in front of the girls." Elowen aligned the edge of a sheet with both hands and did not answer, because if she answered she was going to cry, and she had decided she was not going to cry in the linen room. "Mrs. Larkin," she said instead, "I have a question about the household accounts." The housekeeper went still in the way that people go still when they have been expecting a question and are surprised by which one it is. "The monthly allowance," Elowen said. "Where does it come from? The estate has no money." The Earl said so himself in front of everyone. "So where does the coal come from? The wages? The flour? When Mr. Hind orders supplies in the village, what funds does he draw on?" A long pause. Above them, somewhere, a door opened and closed. "Come with me," said Mrs. Larkin. Prosper Hindy's office was on the ground floor at the back of the house, a narrow room with a high window, shelves of ledgers, and the persistent smell of candle wax and damp stone. Hindy was out. He rode the home farms every Tuesday morning and did not return before 2. Mrs. Larkin opened the middle drawer of the filing cabinet and withdrew a folder of monthly statements. She spread them on the desk without explanation. Elowen looked at them. £40 a month advanced against the estate's credit line by the financial institution holding the primary debt. The institution was listed by abbreviation only. CTS Holdings, Edinburgh, CTS. 12 statements. 12 months. Before Elowen arrived, before the wedding, before any of this, for at least a year and likely longer, £40 a month had been flowing into Carrenmore House from her grandfather's company. "Mrs. Larkin," she said. Her voice came out strange. "Who handles the receipt of these funds?" "Mr. Hind signs for them," said the housekeeper. "He always has. His lordship doesn't. His lordship doesn't much care for figures." Elowen turned over one of the statements. At the bottom, a payment confirmation slip, countersigned in a small, cramped hand. P. Hind. And beside it, a reference number that matched not the estate account but a second column she had not noticed until now. A separate ledger code, handwritten in ink, fractionally darker than the printed text around it. She looked at the ledger code for a long moment. "Where is the second ledger?" she asked. Mrs. Larkin's hands went very still. "I don't know what you mean, my lady." "There is always a second ledger," said Elowen, who had grown up in 2 rooms above a clockmaker's shop and had watched her mother manage a household on less than £12 a year and knew exactly what creative accounting looked like. "Someone is noting these payments twice, the estate account and something else. Where is it?" There was a long silence. Then Mrs. Larkin went to the back shelf and moved 3 volumes of old tenancy rolls aside and drew out from behind them a slim cloth-bound book, brown, unmarked on the spine. Elowen opened it. It took her 4 minutes to understand what she was reading. Then she sat down in Hindy's chair and started from the beginning. CTS Holdings had not simply been extending the estate's credit line. Every month for 14 months, a payment had arrived, £40 as stated. But the payment received by the estate was £26. The remaining 14 had been noted as a handling fee and transferred to a private account held by an Edinburgh firm Elowen did not recognize. Every month. For over a year. She added it in her head. £14, 14 months, just under £200. Her grandfather's money. Going into Prosper Hindy's pocket. She said nothing. Not that day, and not for the week that followed. She needed to understand the full shape of it first. She spent those 7 days moving quietly through the house, helping in the kitchen, sitting with Mrs. Larkin over the household inventory, asking questions that seemed to be about curtain fabric and candle stock, and were about something else entirely. She found 3 more irregularities. She found a discrepancy in the timber valuation. She found an invoice for fence repairs that had been submitted twice under different dates. And because she could not sit still in a cold house and wait, and because she needed to do something with her hands, she walked 3 miles down the hill to the village of Carrenmore Cross and asked the dressmaker there, a widow named Mrs. Coyle, whether she needed any help. Mrs. Coyle had a mouth full of pins and a face like a woman who had seen a great many things and was not easily surprised by any of them. She took the pins out one at a time and set them on the counter. "You're the new countess," she said. "I am. And you're asking me for sewing work." "I am, at whatever the going rate is." Mrs. Coyle looked at her for a long moment. Then she handed her a length of dark wool and said, "Hem that. If the stitching's bad, I'll say so." The stitching was not bad. Elowen had been hemming things since she was 9 years old, and her mother's eyes had begun to fail. By the end of the first week, the village knew she was coming. By the end of the second, it had sorted itself the way village opinion always does. Not into what was funny, but into what was wrong. A woman does not walk 3 miles each way in February to hem cloth for 2 shillings if she has any other option. The village understood that, and the village, it turned out, had a considerable number of opinions about the Earl of Carrenmore, which it had simply lacked the occasion to express, before now. She was given a jar of preserved plums by the blacksmith's wife. She was given 3 offers of a ride back up the hill that she gratefully refused. The schoolmaster, a quiet, serious man named Mr. Pembury, stopped her outside the church hall and said he had 40 children and no assistant, and could she possibly? No, he was sorry. It was an absurd thing to ask a countess. "Wednesdays and Fridays," said Elowen, "after 3. Mr. Pembury put his hat back on his head and said, "Yes," and then stood there for a moment, as though he had expected a different conversation. She was happier than she had been in 4 months. She turned that fact over on the walk, back up the hill each evening, turning it the way you turn something unfamiliar, to check it from all sides. She had 40 shillings in a tin that she had earned with her own hands. She had 40 children who called her Miss Elowen because she had asked them to, and because their parents approved of a lady who walked to work and did not complain about the mud. She had somewhere to be. She had never had £12,000 and had never seen £12,000 and had been given a number on paper and a cold house and a husband who had decided she was a liability. And 6 shillings she made herself was worth more to her than any of it. And in the village she listened. In the shop and the schoolroom and over the workbench, she listened. She learned that the home farms had been underpaying their rents for 2 years because Hindy had told the tenants there was a new rate, a rate that did not appear anywhere in the estate records. She learned that the timber assessment had been conducted by a man who had arrived from Edinburgh and left the same day and whom no one had seen since. She learned from 4 different people, in 4 different conversations, always in the same lowered voice, that Prosper Hind sent a package to Edinburgh on the last Friday of every month. Always the same address. Always by private courier rather than post. She had stopped feeling ashamed somewhere around the 3rd week and started feeling something else. Something quieter and steadier and much more useful. And she was beginning to understand what it was. The Earl rode through Carrenmore House on a Thursday afternoon in March. He had not planned to. He had business at the mill property, 2 miles east, and came back through the village because the road was washed out. He was passing the schoolhouse when he heard children's voices inside, and through the wavy, cheap glass of the window, he saw his wife. She was standing at the board with a piece of chalk, and she was not writing. She was waiting. A boy of about 8 was standing beside her, reading haltingly from a primer, his finger moving under each word. Every few seconds he stopped, and she waited with her whole body, not performing patience, actually patient, and when he found the word himself, her face changed. He sat on his horse in the lane for rather longer than the situation required. He had a very clear picture of what his wife was. He had constructed it efficiently and without cruelty. A woman from a family that had made promises it could not keep, who had arrived in his house bringing nothing, and had so far shown no signs of changing that assessment. He had not troubled to revise it, because revising it would have required him to look more carefully, and looking more carefully at a problem he had already categorized as insoluble was not something he had ever found useful. He had never once seen her laugh. He turned the horse and rode up the hill and arrived home in less time than the road should have allowed, and he sat in his study in front of the fire and thought about it, and arrived at nothing useful, and eventually went to bed. Hindi came to him on a Friday evening, 2 weeks later, with a glass of port and a manner that suggested he had been arguing with himself for some time about whether to speak. "Forgive me, my lord," he said, "but there is the matter of her ladyship's activities in the village." Stellan did not look up from his correspondence. "Go on." "She goes 6 days in the week now. The schoolmaster is a man of 27, unmarried, and they are alone in the building on Wednesday and Friday afternoons." He paused exactly long enough. "I say nothing against her, but she is a young woman who has been, forgive me, not well used in this house, and she has begun to look quite happy, away from it." The Earl set his pen down. "I could arrange the carriage," Hindi continued, "for the journey home in the evenings, so that she need not walk in the dark alone." Stellan looked at the fire. He did not agree to the carriage. He said, "That will be all, Hindi," and sat alone afterwards with his hand closed around his pen, thinking about a face changing through wavy glass, and could not decide what to do with the thought. 3 days later, Elowen came into Hindi's office and put a piece of paper on his desk. "I would like to speak to you about the estate accounts," she said. Hindi looked at the paper, then he looked at her, and Elowen saw something move across his face that she had not expected. Not irritation, not dismissal, but for just a moment something very close to fear. It lasted less than a second. Then he was standing, offering her a chair, entirely himself again. "Of course, my lady, though I should mention that the household accounts are quite—" "Not the household accounts," she said, "the CTS payments." A silence. "I've been looking at the monthly statements," she said, "and the second ledger." The room was very quiet. Somewhere above them a clock ticked. "My lady," said Hind, and his voice had shifted into something almost gentle, the tone of a man explaining a difficulty to someone he is not certain can bear it. "I should be careful if I were you. You have been in this house for 4 months. I have been here for 12 years. His lordship signs what I put in front of him because I am the only person in this house who understands the numbers, and I have kept this estate running through things that would have finished a lesser man. That is worth a great deal." He came around the desk. He did not touch her. He stood beside the chair and looked down at her and dropped his voice. "You will stop asking about the CTS payments. You will stop looking at that ledger. And if you do not, I will go to his lordship and tell him that his wife has been going through the estate books in secret. He has believed me for 12 years. He has not believed you for 1 single day." He stepped back. "Was there anything else, my lady?" Elowen stood. Her hands were shaking. She made herself take 1 breath before she spoke, because a shaking voice loses an argument before the first sentence is finished, and she had not walked 3 miles in February every day for 6 weeks to lose an argument in a dratty back office. "Mr. Hind," she said, "you did not ask me what the paper was." He looked at her. "I put a piece of paper on your desk and said I wanted to talk about the accounts. You didn't ask what it was. You didn't ask what I had found, or whether I had misread something, or whether I wanted clarification." She picked up the paper. "You went straight to a threat, before I had said the word ledger aloud." The room was very still. "A man only does that," said Elowen, "if he already knows exactly what is in the ledger and exactly what it looks like." She got to the door. "Your grandfather is dead," said Hinde behind her. She stopped with her hand on the frame. The whole world went very small and very loud. "I have known who you are since the settlement papers were filed," he said. "There is a clerk in Edinburgh who is less careful than he thinks. Cyrus Trescott died 6 weeks ago. His estate is in probate, and you have been here for 4 months saying nothing. Nothing about the fact that the institution backing this estate is your own grandfather's company. And now, 6 weeks after he dies, you are suddenly very interested in the accounts." He let it sit. "Think carefully about how that looks, my lady." Elowen did not turn around. "I have a great deal of respect for you," said Hinde pleasantly. "You are more capable than anyone in this house has credited. But his lordship's temper and 12 years of his trust are quite enough to hang what I have just described around your neck. And a story only needs to sound true." She walked out into the kitchen yard and stood by the pump with both hands on the iron handle until her breathing steadied. She could not tell Stellan. She understood that now. The moment she opened her mouth, Hin's version was already built, already waiting. She knew all along. She watched this house go under and said nothing. She waited until the old man died. It was true enough to be believed. She had said nothing out of shame, and shame is the one thing in the world that cannot be explained to a man who has already decided you are hiding something. She went back to the village. She finished 3 yards of hemming. She did not stop counting things. They found a ring in her sewing basket in late March. The Carrenmore emerald brooch, 300 years old. The one thing on the estate that was genuinely worth something, which had always lived in the locked case in the study. It was nestled in the basket lining, below the thread. They found it at 8:30 in the evening, after Hin came to the Earl at dinner and said, very quietly, that £40 was missing from the household funds, and that he thought it best the matter be handled openly, so that no one should fall under suspicion. They searched every room, including his own. Hinde made a point of saying. There was a letter on Elowen's writing table, half tucked under the blotter, in a hand that was almost hers, addressed to someone at CTS Holdings in Edinburgh, offering to provide estate valuation documents. And the sentence ended there, unfinished, which made it worse than if it had been complete. Unfinished letters always look more honest than finished ones. There were 7 people in the study when Stellan brought her the letter, the same 7 who had stood along the wall in January. Elowen looked at the letter. She looked at the hand that was almost hers and was not. "That is not my writing," she said. "Whose is it, then?" She opened her mouth. She thought, tell him now. Tell him about the ledger, about CTS, about Hinde's second ledger, and 14 months of diverted payments and the correspondence file he was hiding. Tell him all of it. He would listen tonight, with the thing in his hand. She could see it, the small uncertainty moving in his face, the moment that was still open. Then Hinde said quietly from the back of the room, "The brooch was beneath her shoes, my lord." And the moment closed. The Earl's face went still. He looked at the letter, and then he looked at her, and she could see him choosing the version that required the least of him, the version that matched everything he had already decided. And she could not stop him, because he had been making that choice since March. "Get out of my house," he said. She walked out of Carrenmore House at 10 o'clock on a night in late March with a shawl and nothing else. It was raining. Of course it was raining. She got as far as the gate in the stone wall at the bottom of the drive before her legs went unreliable, and she sat down in the wet grass with her back against the gatepost and stayed there for some time, not crying. She had decided she was not going to cry on his property. Then she got up and walked 3 miles down the hill, because there was nowhere else in the world to go. Mrs. Coyle found her at the shop door at 6 in the morning and said nothing at all except, "Come in," and put her in the back room with a blanket and something hot and sat at the end of the bench until Elowen's hands were steady. The village did not believe a word of it. Not for one single minute. Mrs. Coyle had watched a countess hemcloth for 2 shillings a week and never once complained about the weather or the price or her husband. The blacksmith had walked her home on dark evenings because the road was unlit and somebody ought to, not because she'd asked. Mr. Pembury had 40 children who could now read with less difficulty because of her. The blacksmith's wife had given her preserved plums. Tom Oakes at the mill had fixed a drainage problem on the school path because Miss Elowen had mentioned it was muddy. These were not the actions of a woman stealing emeralds. By noon, there were 50 people standing outside Mrs. Coyle's shop in the rain. By 2 o'clock, there was a letter with 83 signatures on it. 11 of them marked with an X, because 11 of the 83 could not write, but wanted it noted that they had stood there and they meant it. They took it up to the house. Hindy received it at the door and folded it into his pocket and went back to his office and stood for a while with his hands flat on the desk. He had 6 days until the Edinburgh auditor arrived to examine the estate books. 6 days to have the Countess discredited somewhere no one would think to look too hard at her surname. He rode to the magistrate that same afternoon. It was Mrs. Larkin who went to the Earl. She had been at Carrenmore House for 31 years. She had served the previous Earl. She had kept her opinions to herself for the entirety of that time, and on the morning after Elowen was turned out and the rain, she walked up the front staircase, which she had not used in years, the front stairs being for the family, and knocked on the library door and went in without being asked. "My lord," she said, "I am about to be dismissed, so I will say this quickly." The Earl looked up from nothing. He had been sitting in front of the unlit fire for the better part of an hour. "That brooch has lived in the locked case in the study. The key lives on Mr. Hindy's ring, and has done since your father's time. That girl has never had a key to any room in this house except her own, and her own does not lock." Mrs. Larkin folded her hands. "And the second ledger is in a cloth-bound book behind the tenancy rolls on the shelf in Mr. Hindy's office, and if you go and look at it today, you will find money leaving this estate every month that has not gone where it was supposed to go." She got to the door. "She hemmed cloth for 2 shillings a week," she said, "because you told her to, and she never once let a single person in that village hear her say one word against you. You go and ask them. Ask them what she said about you." She closed the door. The Earl sat for a count of perhaps 8. Then he went down the back stairs and put his boot through the panel of Hindy's office door. The cloth-bound book came off the shelf in 4 minutes. It took him 6 more to find the discrepancy, and once he was looking for it, he could not understand how he had never looked before. But he knew the answer to that, and it sat in his stomach like cold iron. He had never looked because Hindy had told him there was nothing to look at, and he had believed him, because believing him had always been simpler than reading a ledger, and he had let himself mistake simple for the same thing as true. Behind the second ledger was a correspondence file. 14 months of letters from CTS Holdings, Edinburgh, all of them opened, all of them answered, not by the estate, but in a handwriting he now recognized, and in the oldest letter in the file, a name he had seen once on the settlement documents and not thought to revisit. The guarantor on the marriage settlement was not an uncle. There had never been an uncle. The guarantor was Cyrus Trescott, his wife's grandfather. Stellan sat down on the floor of the wrecked office with the file across his knees, and thought about a woman carrying curtains alone in the East Gallery at 8:30 in the morning. A woman hemming cloth in a village shop for 2 shillings. A woman standing in front of 7 people in the study saying, "That is not my writing," and him not listening because he had already chosen the version that required the least of him. He thought about what she had not said. For 4 months she had known whose money stood behind this house, had known and had said nothing. He thought he understood why, now. He thought about the particular kind of silence that comes from being ashamed of something that is not your fault and having no way to explain the difference to a man who has already decided what you are. He sent a rider to the village at noon. Then he went to find Hindi and found the office empty, the horse gone from the stable. Careful men, it turns out, know precisely when to run. Hindi would be found. Careful men always leave a paper trail. It is the one thing they cannot stop themselves from doing. The session's hearing was brief. Stellan stood at the front of the room, and when the magistrate asked whether he was present to prosecute, he said, "No. I am here to correct a sworn statement made with false evidence. The evidence was placed by my estate steward, Prosper Hind, who has been diverting funds from this estate for 14 months and who fabricated the letter and the placement of the brooch to prevent discovery. I have the second ledger, the correspondence file, and 14 months of payment confirmations, all in his hand." He laid them on the table. "I would also like to state for the record that my wife was accused publicly, in a room with 7 witnesses. She will be cleared in the same manner, or it is worth nothing." The room was extremely quiet for a moment. Then someone at the back shifted, and the whole crowd seemed to breathe again. The charges were dismissed. Elowen came out of the building into gray morning light and stood at the top of the steps. Mrs. Coyle was crying in the yard and pretending otherwise. Mr. Pembury had his hat in his hands. The blacksmith was standing at the back, with his arms crossed in the way of a man who is satisfied and considers it beneath him to show it. Stellan came out behind her and stopped 5 feet away. "I am not going to ask you for anything," he said. He looked at the street rather than at her. "I have nothing to ask with. There is a room at Mrs. Coyle's and funds for it. And Lady Amelia's, there is an attorney in Edinburgh, a good one, already paid for. Whatever comes next, wherever that is, I have no right to expect you to take me into account." Elowen looked at his hand, still badly wrapped from the cut he'd gotten putting his boot through the office door 3 days ago, and thought about a man who had signed everything put in front of him for 12 years, because it was easier than reading it, and had then broken a door down when it finally mattered. "You broke down a door," she said. "Yes. With your own hand. The alternative was to wait, and I did not want to wait." She was quiet for a moment. "That is the first thing you have done in 4 months that was not about convenience." He looked at her then. Yes, it was. The morning was cold, and the street was muddy, and there were 60 people watching, which was not the ideal setting, and Elowen was aware of every one of them. "You will write to me," she said, at last, "every week, not asking anything. Reporting. The accounts, you will learn to read them yourself, and you will write to me what you find." She paused. "The £14 a month that went the wrong way. It goes to tenant repairs, the schoolroom roof first. Start there." "Yes," he said. "My grandfather's company will hold the estate's credit line at the current terms, because it was his money that kept this house running, and I will not undo that. But the accounts are open to me every quarter, and you sit with me while I go through them." "Yes." She looked at him a moment longer. "My grandfather died without knowing me. I am going to go to Edinburgh and find out who he was, and that will take as long as it takes. You will not ask me when I am coming back." "I understand." "Good," said Elowen Trescott, "then write to me." She walked down the steps, and Mrs. Coyle put a shawl around her shoulders, and the blacksmith stepped aside to let her through, and Mr. Pembury said something, She couldn't quite hear that made her stop and almost smile. Stellan stood at the top of the steps and watched her go, and did not call after her, because she had asked him not to ask, and it was the first instruction she had given him that he intended to follow without being asked twice. He wrote every week. The first letter was long and she did not answer it. The second was shorter and she did not answer that one either. The third contained a single line at the bottom that said, "The schoolroom roof is done. Pembury reports it took 5 days and you predicted 4, and he hopes I will convey that you were almost right." She did not answer that one, but she laughed, alone, in a sitting room in Edinburgh that smelled of old paper and sea salt, and the quiet of a man who had spent 40 years making himself worth something, and had run out of time before he could show it to the person who mattered. By the 6th letter, Stellan had stopped asking and started reporting. "The tenancy roll has been corrected. The fence on the north pasture is repaired. Mrs. Larkin raised her own wages and informed me after the fact, and I find I cannot argue with the arithmetic." Elowen was learning in those months what her grandfather had been. She sat in his office and read his papers, and spoke with Mr. Garrett, the senior solicitor who had known Cyrus Trescott for 30 years, and she began to understand the shape of a man who had been too proud to be wrong about one thing for most of his life, and had spent the last 3 years of it trying, imperfectly, to make it right. In the tin box in the lowest desk drawer, she found a photograph of her mother, taken when she was perhaps 20, laughing, out of doors, wind pulling her hair sideways. On the back, in that heavy pressing hand, Margaret, 1867. He had kept it. All those years, he had kept every one of her mother's letters, and he had kept this photograph, and he had gone to his grave without sending either of them back. She sat with the photograph for a long time. She thought about a woman in 2 rooms above a clockmaker's shop who had gone to her grave believing her father had thrown her letters into the fire. She thought about what it costs a person to keep writing to someone who never answers, year after year, and whether it had been stubbornness or hope or simply love with nowhere else to go. Then she picked up Stellan's latest letter and read it again, and picked up a pen and wrote, "The north pasture fence, what timber did you use? Send me the figures against the original estimate. I want to see the calculation." It was not an answer. It was something better than an answer. She arrived back at Carrenmore House on a Thursday afternoon in October, 11 months after she had walked out of it in the rain. She came up the drive in the late afternoon light, with a solicitor's file under one arm and Stellan's last 6 letters in her coat pocket, and she walked in through the front door and straight to the library without stopping. He was there. He was working on the quarterly accounts, and he had made 3 errors and corrected 2 of them himself, which was 2 more than she had expected. She sat down across from him and spread the file on the table between them. "You've got the timber costs wrong," she said, "but the acreage calculation in the 3rd column. I haven't seen that method before, and it's faster than mine. Show me how you did it." Stellan Golt set his pen down. He looked at her across the table. "You're staying," he said. "I haven't decided that," said Elowen. "Ask me in 6 months. Show me the method." He showed her. They argued about it for 40 minutes. Mrs. Larkin brought tea in twice without being asked, and was heard afterwards in the kitchen, saying she did not know what to make of the sound coming out of the library on an accounts evening, and that she had been in this house for 31 years, and had not heard it before, and that she did not intend to examine it too closely, because some things were better received than understood. In the great hall now, above the fire, there hangs a small frame, 4 inches square, plain oak, with glass over it and a photograph behind the glass. A woman in a field laughing, the wind in her hair, a date in faded ink on the back that no visitor has ever seen. No one who comes to Carrenmore asks about it, because it does not look like the kind of thing with a formal explanation. It looks like something personal, something that was kept a long time before it found the right wall, which is exactly what it is.